everyone. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are recording this podcast in Stamford, Connecticut, on the traditional lands of the Signoi, Lenape, Mohegan, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. We honor their history, resilience, and ongoing presence in this region. We also recognize our guest, Dr. Sean Huddleston, resides and works in Indianapolis, Indiana, which occupies the ancestral territories of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples. We pay the respects to their enduring connections to these lands.
Welcome to Bridging Worlds, where we explore growth, resilience, and the power of connection. I'm Amanda Harris Carter.
Malcolm Carter Harris. This week, we challenge perspectives, dive into meaningful conversations, and explore how leadership, learning, and culture shape our world.
Today, we're discussing the future of higher education, the role of institutions like Martin University, and how universities navigate funding and policy changes. Martin University, as Indiana's only predominantly Black institution, has been a leader in expanding access to education. Recently, a decision in the state budget proposal has raised important questions about how schools like Martin are supported.
Our guest today, Dr. Sean Huddleston, and I want to stop for a moment to recognize Dr. Sean Huddleston, who's president of Martin University. I want to preface by saying I've known Dr. Huddleston since I was about 5 years old. So he is like my brother. I've always looked up to him, always looked at him as my brother, and I'm excited to have you here. Martin University's mission is to have a broader landscape of higher education. And what's next for the university? Dr. Huddleston, welcome to Bridging Worlds.
From both Malcolm and Amanda, it is truly an honor and pleasure to be with you on the world-class Bridging Worlds podcast. And let me just say, you cannot understate the fact that we are truly brothers. I mean, we literally grew up in the same house. I'm trying to remember how many times your mom disciplined me. It might have been about the same amount of times as my mom disciplined you or my mom disciplined both of us. So, no question.
He literally just told me that story about FAIR yesterday.
And I'm telling you, this when we talk about our blood runs deep together, it truly does. And so I would not be any place else in this moment than to be here with both of you. So thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning.
Absolutely. We couldn't have done this without our mothers. You've been close to my mom. I've been close to your mom. Yes. When I was in college, your mom was dean of my college. People literally thought that she was my mom. And they would always address me and say, your mom, your mom, your mom. So that's really how close we truly
I think they dragged us both across the finish line, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
I think that with your mom having a doctorate, my mom having a doctorate, I think they both inspired. I think they were the first, for me, they were the first people, not just women, but the first people that I knew to actually earn a doctorate. And so I know that your mom had a very, very big role in my life and in my development.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, she had 2 degrees from Wayne State University after she went to Bluefield State. She's on my mind today. She isn't feeling well. She's been in the hospital, and we hope the best for her health.
Well, she's a fighter, and we know that, and God is good. So between the two, always, she's going to be just fine.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So now we're going to head into our first segment, the higher education's role in workforce and community development. Dr. Huddleston, let's start broadly. Universities have long followed a traditional model of education. But many students today, especially non-traditional learners, have different needs. How does Martin University approach higher education differently to meet those challenges?
Thank you for the question. It's a really good question. So I want to give you a little bit context and history around Martin University. And if I become too verbose, please feel free to cut me off. So Martin University was founded in 1977 by one of our nation's only African-American monks. We've only had 2 African-American monks. His name was Father Boniface Hart. He grew up in the Catholic Church. He grew up in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, knew at 8 years old that he wanted to serve the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church was not welcoming at that time and accepting African Americans who wanted to serve at higher levels of ministry to the church. And so there were no parishes or seminaries that accepted African Americans until mid-60s or so, when one opened in Indiana called St. Menrick. And so folks from his parish got money together and sent him there. And so he began to work and serve in that church. And he did a fantastic job. He always saw education as the key. He wound up getting 3 degrees, speaking 7 languages, and continued to work really hard in that regard. But as he was doing his work and we came into the civil rights movement, he, especially here in Indiana, which is a founding state for the KKK, he really believed that the Catholic Church should be the place that where peace emanates from. And if anybody could solve some of the disconnects and challenges that existed between Black and brown communities and all of the discrimination that occurred against those communities, surely the church could. The Catholic Church wasn't necessarily willing to lean in that heavily into it. And so he decided to take his mission to the streets. And he went and became an activist in the community. As he was working with gangs and working with people, young people in particular, who he thought could benefit from higher education, he came to learn a couple things. Number one was that many of them had either tried college somewhere else or never tried college at all. Those who tried college somewhere else wind up boomeranging back to the communities because they didn't find a sense of belonging on those campuses. Most were predominantly white campuses. The second thing that he found was that many of them did not have people in their family who had already gone to college. So there were no examples as to what benefits could exist from having a college degree for them. And so his thought was that if he could get to the parents and caregivers, some of these students who were not choosing college or not completing college, then they would have better luck and better success in getting those students to continue or at least give it a try. And so you know how it is, Malcolm. We just talked about our moms. If your mother or your aunt or a close relative or adult tells you that you ought to go to college, it's very different than when a guidance counselor tells you you ought to go to college. And so he decided that we needed to create a university that focused on the parents and caregivers so that we could take a multi-generational approach to higher education. I share all that to say that our entire history and founding has been focused on that multi-generational approach, that non-traditional age student. In many cases, we have multiple generations attending Martin at the same time. 2 years ago, at our commencement, I was able to confer degrees to a grandmother, her daughter, and her grandson, all in the same class. And so those are the types of experiences and focuses that I think are important if we're going to truly advance higher education. So that non-traditional age student is almost like the forgotten demographic that is still extremely important in helping us to really kind of advance the entire landscape of degrees in higher education.
Love it. Love it.
I think an interesting aside too is that Malcolm and I, under that definition, just for instance, like when you think about age, the stereotypical age of collegiate students, I didn't get my BA until my early 30s. I was out of school in between schools for a decade.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much pressure for, you work your butt off, you graduate from a good high school, you're pressured for all the good reasons, all the right reasons, you go straight into college. And then I knew that my financial aid depended on a good GPA, and I was only allowed to work study jobs, and I was doing some art modeling outside, like anything under the table. And so there was pressure to stay in school. My John Jay students, who were under numerous stresses for numerous different societal and familial reasons and economic hardships, they were suffering from so many mental health conditions because they were dreamers and their parents didn't understand depression or anxiety to the extent that they could get they could request a medical semester off. So Malcolm and I both have our own backstories in addition to how there's not obviously one route to success to academics. How we define academics is just as personal as who our parents are, and that makes it all the better.
It absolutely does.
Our stories are similar. I mean, Malcolm knows well that essentially I went from college dropout to college president.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
I graduated from Detroit Public Schools, arguably one of the worst high schools in Detroit Public Schools.
Mhm.
Got into Howard University when I graduated from high school. I was smart enough to be at Howard, but I didn't have the discipline to stay at Howard
Mhm.
University. And so
Mhm.
bounced to Alabama State University where I had my greatest academic experience, but I lost my way again there. And I believe it was close to 20 years before I went back and got my bachelor's degree. And it was only because I was offered a job at my employer, promotion,
Yeah.
and our HR department said that they could not extend it to me because I didn't have my degree. And
Yeah.
that was the defining moment for me. I
Yeah.
remember my mom saying to me, "This is a good example of why you should always put yourself in a position that's no one can tell you no for something that you really want."
Yeah.
And after I had that wake up call, I decided I was going to get every degree that was on
Mhm.
earth so
Yeah.
that I could never have that happen again.
Yeah, I mean, our stories are all similar. Same with me.
Yeah,
I went to a historical Black college university, Hampton University, had my own personal struggles there, left school. And I needed to kind of get my head together. I need to get into therapy. I need to really kind of figure out who I was. And eventually went to Mary Grove College, Catholic school that Sean knows well because that's where he also went to school.
yeah,
And employer that Dr. Huddleston, I keep saying Sean, but Dr. Huddleston went to Mishcon. I was also very thankful for because I ended up consulting with Mishcon, which is my first big consulting job when I worked for this company in Seattle called the Mosaic Company.
mhm,
And the Mishcon people were so wonderful. I eventually ran my own station in Ludington, Michigan. So I'm
yeah.
very proud to be part of that Mishcon family too. But I'm glad that people can understand the importance of not necessarily going through the traditional way. There are non-traditional ways that you can go through college, like places like Martin University, and still have a lot of success in this world.
Can I, before we go to the next question, can I just tell you that our fastest growing age demographic right now are students between the ages of 22 and 26. When I came here 6 years ago, the average age of our students was 38. It's now down to about 31 and a half. It's growing so fast at 22 and 26 because these are people who decided when they graduated from high school that they weren't going to college. They needed to get to work. And they got into the workplace and realized that they could get in the door, but they couldn't get up the ladder without a degree. And so they're now coming back to us. And actually, we're having more success with males than we are with females right now, which is a different
Mm.
phenomenon for
Uh,
higher education. So
It is.
just interesting times and changes happening.
And it goes without saying that those people that have work experience, that have, raised a family or been through partnerships and buried their parents or what have you, that they offer so much to the general population, the more traditional students.
Yeah.
They've been some of they're veterans, or if they're senior citizens, if they are getting back in school after a long maternity leave, what have you. And I think it's so important for you to also, like myself, to model and be transparent for our
Yeah.
students, because
I
I
agree.
feel like this is one of those things like money that we don't talk about that. And it just creates another layer of shame and secrecy. And that's how they get us. That's
I,
how the powers of be get us, because we're competing with one another. There's only one piece of the pie that we're all scrambling. So I
yeah.
love this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's segue to our next question for you. There's been a lot of discussion about how higher education should better align with workforce development.
Mhm.
How do you see Mountain University preparing students for success in both their careers and their communities?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So what's interesting is that I think broadly, higher education has always seen themselves in the knowledge creation space, right? That's really what higher education was founded on, and many research institutions still lean into that, right?
Hmm.
It's almost like owning knowledge creation, but the reality, and this is the approach at Martin University, the reality is that our job is not to own knowledge creation, but it is to franchise it and make good owners of other people or other organizations. And so our approach has been a focus on partnering with employers so that we are focused on mutual investment and mutual development. And so instead of us telling them that we are going to create psychologists or we're going to create data scientists or other folks, and this is what we're going to teach them. They're going to come work for you and they're going to bring all that knowledge to you. We're sitting side by side with employers and we're saying, hey, what are the jobs today and the jobs of tomorrow that you need to have relevant workforce and career development happening for? And what talent do you need? What do you need them to know? In fact, would you help us to build a curriculum around the things that you need them to know? And if there is a different type of credential that is not a degree that you think would be beneficial, let's do that. So here's one example. We are partnered with Pacers Sports and Entertainment in a program that we have called Martin Works, which is essentially our major career development program at our university. And I sat with their COO, and she mentioned to me that one of the things that no one teaches anyone is arena operations. They treat hospitality management. There's all these other kind of programs, but nothing around arena operations. So I said, well, tell us what you need to know around arena operations, and we will build the curriculum and we will train people for arena operations. We did the same thing with a company called Cook Medical. Cook Medical was building a facility in Indianapolis. They're based in Bloomington, building a facility in Indianapolis, and went into a community that's down the street from Martin University. And for context, Martin University is in the most economically depressed neighborhood in the state of Indiana, not just in Indianapolis, but in the state of Indiana. When you look at some of the data that comes out, we're at the top of the worst and the bottom of the best statistics as it relates to economic vitality, educational attainment, so on and so forth. And so with that, they said, we're going to be in that community. We want to solve some of the problems of the community. And one of the problems in that community was that on one side, there was a food desert, and on the other side, there was a food swamp, right? So it was food there, but it was not healthy foods. And so they said, we've got to solve for that problem. And so we'll do that by putting a market in the area, and we'll find some people from the community who will really run that market. Well, they can buy it from us, back from us over time, but we want that to occur. Right? And so they came to us and said, how can you help? And we said, well, perhaps we can create a certification that's a stackable credential in our business program that is focused on grocery store ownership and operations. And so we partnered with Kroger, with essentially their lead trainer for all of their store management, and said, help us to create this curriculum for store operations. And then we built in we already have an entrepreneurship program, but we connected our entrepreneurship program with this store operations program, and we were able to educate 2 people who would become the owner operators of this grocery store. So I think this customized approach to credentialing and to training and stackable credentials that ultimately offer credit into a degree program is something that is part of our approach anyway at Martin University.
I think that that's great. A lot of organizations, a lot of businesses should really look at that approach. I used to teach, and I helped start, and I was a founder of a school called Henry Ford Academy of Manufacturing Arts and Sciences. The school is a high school, and we were in Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. For those who aren't familiar with it, it is the largest museum in the United States. Started by Henry Ford, things like the Wright brothers' planes are there with their first planes and the first automobiles, etc. The school, the foundation was technology to make sure that people were ready for manufacturing, etc., for the future. We partner with Michigan State University, along with, of course, the actual museum and village, and then Ford Motor Company. The actual Ford Motor Company engineers would come into the school and work with the kids and really help them develop their skill set into a program at Michigan State or another university, and then bring them into the fold at Ford Motor Company. So they were developing them to be ready for the workforce starting at the age of 14 years old. These programs aren't happening enough. So it's great to see Martin University doing this and really kind of seeing the future of our country and where we really need to go to make sure we're making a difference and not just providing an education to make money, an education to bring money in to build buildings and to bring professors in, but actually to do something that's practical in our society.
Yeah, it is really about the ROI for the student. at the end of the day, students, they don't have 4 or 8 years to see that return on their investment. Neither do employers.
Mhm.
And so our job is to get to that ROI as fast as we can for both.
I did want to ask a sort of follow-up question. My background is creative writing, English composition, rhetoric.
Yeah.
And so in conversations like this, I follow along like from a business person perspective, but I often feel lost as someone in the liberal arts.
Yeah.
So, as you might imagine, like I think at the top of anybody's skill set should be communication, argument,
100%.
reading, writing, literacy, however you define it.
Absolutely.
So how do you have these alternative, what I would consider sort of cutting edge programs for siphoning students more gracefully into the workplace and being fully embraced? So what happens with what we used to call as Gen Xer, the core curriculum
Yeah. Honestly.
requirements, reading, writing, literature, which has, there are scientific studies that prove in the bodies that literature makes people more empathetic, that fiction in particular makes people more empathetic, which is like an underutilized soft skill in
Yeah.
business. So what would you say to the less quantifiable, the more
Yeah.
subjective, the imagination that led to companies like Apple, et cetera?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, good question. So I would say that, first of all, liberal arts and humanities are underrated, right? And so, unfortunately, higher education, as well as I would say, even many industries, are very silent, right? And it's kind of, there's this either or approach, right? Either you are in some sort of vocational technical training, or you're in something that is less defined in their in some of the examples that are used and talked about. But the most transferable skills always have come from liberal arts and humanities. It is
Mhm.
in every single industry, every single profession. But we don't talk about it that way because we've siloed it so much.
Mhm.
And so the core curriculum, even that, so you take a look at that gen eds, right? You have to do your gen eds before you get into your degree, if you will, your degree courses, because you got to understand those fundamentals so that you can carry them through. But very rarely do we do it at the same time, right? And so there again is that either or approach. So our focus has been to make sure that everything happens in a very transferable way, right? And so that is how we have been addressing it here at Martin University, is to recognize that what happens in an English or writing class as you just pointed out, these are essential skills that are not just used in the career and workplace. This is used in life.
Yes.
So if you're shaping someone's life, and if we are about learning for life and we are about changing generations, then we have to make sure that we are not just looking at the economic, we're looking at the social as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to give a shout out to Dr. DeRoche, Dr. Schaefer at Marigold College, because my favorite class at that liberal arts college was my literature class. So shout out to them. They helped me become also, as many others, become the man that I am today, where I feel like I've done a great job being able to communicate. Maybe not as good as my lovely wife, but I do my best. But thank you for that. All
You're
right.
healthy, man. You figured out the formula. Good for you.
Yeah, hey, it does. None of this hurts. So give it a whirl.
All right. I want to ask you a question getting to the state budget of Indiana
Yeah.
and its impact on Martin University. Recently, Martin University was left out of the governor's proposed 2025 to 2027 state budget after receiving funding in the previous budget cycle. What has that decision meant for the university?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked that question, because I've been spending a lot of time kind of repositioning some of the messaging that came out of that, and essentially kind of setting the record straight. So that news that came to pass actually came out when I was out of the country, literally on the other side of the world. And so I learned it probably at the same time that most of the other people learned it. But I want to be clear about a couple of things. Let me tell you a little bit about the genesis of the funding that we did get in the state budget, and then kind of where we are today. So our previous governor, Governor Eric Holcomb, a little bit over 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'd like to sit down and have a conversation with you and understand a little bit more about Martin University. I understand that you take a bit of a non-traditional approach to higher education. You're doing some things that have been intriguing that I've heard about. It just came out of the blue that he reached out, and so I had the opportunity to go spend time with him. We were supposed to meet for 30 minutes and wound up talking for about 2 hours at his
Wow.
residence. And so essentially what came out of that meeting was a couple of different things. Number one, he did a fantastic job of attracting industry and economic development to our state. The part that needed to be resolved and still needs to be resolved is identifying how do we build the talent to be able to make that occur, to make sure that we have enough employees for these companies and industries that are coming into our state. We recognize that Martin University had a very high percentage, the highest percentage of graduates who stay in Indiana after they graduate. 100% of our graduates stay in Indiana, not necessarily just in central Indiana either. And so as the governor for the whole state of Indiana, he recognized that there was some ability. He also recognized that as a smaller institution, we're a bit more nimble than others. Our faculty are not tenured, for example, and so and have not sought tenure. It gives us an opportunity to be a bit more flexible on things and to incubate ideas in a different way, which was very, very appealing to him. Most importantly, there was an opportunity for us to lean into some of the very specific workforce needs of the state, work alongside employers that we were already doing to help to kind of build out this workforce. And so he made a decision for the first time in the history of our state to ask for funding for Martin University in the biennium budget to support the training and preparation for more teachers in our state, for more law enforcement professionals, for more STEM professionals, and more people in business professionals,
Mhm.
including entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
And so we were very successful in getting that funding, and we met every objective that had set before us with the funding. We needed to attract more students to our university. We have record new student enrollment because the funding helped us to be able to build out some of our recruitment strategies. We launched two technology-based programs, one in cybersecurity, the other in data analytics that we did not have
Mhm.
prior to that. And it's very aligned with the needs of the state. In 2022, Martin suffered a cyber attack. A group out of Russia attacked us, and we had some challenges that we had to overcome from that. And so other smaller organizations that don't have an infrastructure to support cybersecurity have those same needs. And so we're helping to create people in that regard. Our teacher preparation programs for our early childhood education and our elementary education program are two of the fastest growing that we have. So we did meet
Mhm.
all the things that we said that we do. We actually exceeded many of the state averages in those regards by double digits in some cases. So what we thought was that the original funding we got was proposed by the governor at $10 million, was approved by the House at $10 million, was stripped out completely by the Senate. And then after doing some lobbying with some of the folks in the Senate, we were able to claw back about 5 million of it. So we have $5 million at the last minute, it was turned into a grant that was coming from the Indiana Commission for Higher Education. The challenge with grants coming from a state agency is by statute, they have to be reimbursable grants. And so we basically have to lay out the cash to pay the expense and then get reimbursed for that. Because it is a grant, there is a significant portion of the grant that is restricted, right? And so now what was meant to be first $10 million in capacity building funding from our university, and then $5 million in capacity building funding from our university turned into about $1.5 million of that per year that could be used for
Mhm.
general operations, and the rest is restricted for programmatic development, which means it also increases our operating budget, right? And so still, with that being said, we recognized that this was a grant, and any good business person knows that when you get a grant, it is one-time and restricted funding that you do not include in your general operating fund,
Mhm.
right? It's almost like getting a bonus from work. That doesn't mean that your annual compensation has changed, it means that you got some extra money. And so we organized our finances to not depend on the additional money, but to use the additional money for growth, right? So because we did so well with the first grant, we thought that there'd be an opportunity to have a conversation about scaling up some of the things that we piloted in the new biennium budget. And the governor, I think his initial thought of this funding was that because we're the state's only predominantly Black institution, that the funding was aligned with diversity, equity, and inclusion, which in fact, the funding was aligned with workforce development, which is a major part of his agenda. And so we had several community leaders and a few lawmakers make an appeal to the governor to reconsider his position on not at least having a conversation with Martin University about the potential of having a second amount of funding, even if it is a grant, allocated to Martin University. So the initial conversations about Martin being defunded is not necessarily a true statement, because as a private institution, we are not funded by the state of Indiana, so we can't be defunded. And being left out of the budget is, I think it's a fair statement to say, but we did not have a expectation that there would be a second wave, and we did not organize our finances to assume that there would be a second allocation of funding. Very fortunately, though, the governor has heard, he heard the community and he heard from the lawmakers, and now understands, because of his workforce development funding, he's agreed to meet with us. So he'll actually be visiting Martin University next week. And we'll have an opportunity to have a private conversation. And hopefully what will come out of that will be an opportunity to maybe receive some additional funding. But we're not dependent on it. What we're depending on is the community and everyone else wrapping around Martin University, everyone across the country wrapping around Martin University, and recognizing that we do add value and we do have tangible outcomes whenever someone invests in our institution.
I will say I would love to be a fly on the wall when that conversation takes place.
Well, I think it's going to be a very productive conversation. I am encouraged by his decision to come and visit us, and we will just, we'll hope for good things.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Excellent.
We understand that community leaders, including Elder Lionel Rush and the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, met with Governor Braun to discuss Martin University's role and impact. What do you know about that conversation that you felt comfortable sharing with us?
Absolutely. So first of all, Elder Lionel Rush is a friend of mine and of Martin University. He's also one of my fraternity brothers and an alum of Martin University. He got a master's degree from this institution. And so we have been connected since I started here in 2019. And so he did share with me the conversation they had with the governor. He took, I think, 25 people with him from the community. Many of them were alums of the university or people who had had an experience or relationship with our founder, Father Boniface Harton. The intent of that conversation was not solely about Martin University. It was really about some of the governor's proposed policies and positions, his position on MEI over DEI. The M stands for merit. I forget what the other two, the E and the I, stand for. And so they wanted him to further define that. There is some potential or proposed legislation in the state to dismantle the public school systems. And Governor Braun is a supporter of choice and believes that charter schools and vouchers are more important. And so there are some members of the General Assembly who have proposed legislation to dismantle the public school systems here. And so there was some concern there as well. And then Martin was on the agenda for discussions as well. What I understand from Elder Rush, what they wanted to do is just make sure the governor truly understood the purpose and impact of Martin University, how we are a rich community resource. We call ourselves a communiversity, right? So that means we are a higher education institution and we are community center. And so we are in, of, and for the community in all ways. We have a large multi-purpose space that holds about 800 people. It will do about 350 in round tables that we make available to the community. Many small nonprofit organizations can't afford to rent space to hold their big events and dinners and things of that nature. We make that available to folks. We hold some very important conversation with the community about things that are happening. And so we're a really critical anchor institution and resource in this community. And so they wanted him to understand before he made this unilateral decision what Martin University means to the state of Indiana and to this community. When I was sharing with you about my conversation with previous governors, one of the thoughts is that the impact of Martin University could actually be replicated in other areas of the state that might be challenged. Cities like Gary and South Bend and some of the other areas that have faced many economic challenges over the years, there could be some opportunity to create some uplift in those spaces if we can get it right here first. And so making that a part of the conversation was really important. And so their goal was to make sure that the governor understood more about Martin University and its impact before he made any final decisions. And I think they were quite successful.
Going into your meeting with Governor Braun, do you have at this point very specific things that you want to get out of that conversation?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Many of them we've talked about already, but essentially my hope is that he understands our role as really the state's only university that is dedicated to work-based learning. There are other institutions that have work-based learning embedded in some way, but it is central to what we do. Another aspect that I want to make sure that he understands is that we are all about the ROI. Not just for our students, but also for the state of Indiana. And so we are organized to support the needs of our entire state from a workforce and economic development perspective. And so I'm hoping that he has an opportunity to understand that. We're one of the leaders in the state in credit for prior learning. We make sure that students are getting college credit for their previous work and volunteer experiences, essentially credits from the College of Life. That helps people get to degrees. Last but not least, we believe that the college degree is a game changer for individuals and families, and it does create generational wealth. There is all types of data and research that absolutely supports that. But there are also other types of credentials that colleges and universities should be leaning more heavily into that Martin already has. Whether they're stackable or standalone, we are creating the space for that, and we are exploring competency-based education over the credit as a pathway in. And so we're an innovator of higher education. We're leaning into the fact that we are the state's predominantly Black institution. If you view it just as that, then we probably won't have a long conversation. So my hope is that he sees us for all that we are to the state of Indiana.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now we're going to shift to the future of Martin University. Beyond the immediate funding situations, what are some of the biggest priorities for Martin University in the next few years?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. It's one of the things that I enjoy talking about the most. I was recently interviewed by one of our local media outlets, Mirror Indy, and the title of that article, or somewhere in that article, I talk about the bright future that awaits Martin University. I think there is so much untapped potential for the university as well as for the higher education landscape in the state of Indiana that I'm chomping at the bit to get going. I have been involved with a large delegation of individuals here in our state that is looking at the professional apprenticeship model. We have been studying the Swiss model of education and workforce, the connection between the two. And what's very interesting there is that formal education essentially ends at the 10th grade. Students go to school up until the 10th grade, and then they shift into a vocational focus. And that could either be working through an apprenticeship or working directly for an employer or exploring other options. There are many on-ramps and off-ramps for those students. And it's been a system that's in place for 50 years. And you don't hear a lot about economic challenges in Zurich or in Switzerland because they've really kind of built up this pathway. And so there are many of us that are looking at that. We launched a professional apprenticeship model back in 2021 at Martin University. And so in some respects, folks are still catching up a little bit, but we're very happy to be part of that. I think the idea of work-based learning, whether it be internships, apprenticeship, or project-based learning, integrated into the curriculum and the academic programs as a requirement is critically important. We want to make sure that we are getting our students to their careers and to their goals even before they graduate from Martin University. So that is a big, big focus for us. A second one, I think, is helping to support the needs of people who have some college and no degree. I'm really excited that we are going to be launching a degree completion program at Martin this coming fall. In our degree completion program, for people who have achieved, I think, at least 60 credit hours, they need to finish and finish fast. We're titling it Finish and Flourish. We'll be able to do that with the addition of credit for prior learning as a requirement there. So with credit for prior learning, students can actually earn up to 60 credit hours for their previous work and volunteer experience. On average, our students are earning about 24 of those credit hours. And so if someone has completed 60 credit hours somewhere else and they get, let's say, 24 credit hours for workplace learning, they will have 84 credit hours of a 120 credit hour undergraduate curriculum. So you can get done in a year and get the promotions and the career directory opportunity. So we're excited about that, as well as our fully online degree programs that we're launching. So we're really excited about that. A little bit longer term, we have 3 pillars that we're going to be leaning into from a academic focus. One of them will be the business of healthcare. I think you know that Indianapolis and Indiana is a hub for healthcare and life sciences, with Eli Lilly being headquartered here, as well as some really phenomenal healthcare systems. We have strong partnerships with all of them. In fact, I have a meeting today to talk about the development of a community health worker program at Martin University. So the business of healthcare is going to be one of our pillars. Another interesting pillar for us will be the business of sports. So we have a number of sports organizations and host a number of large sporting events here in Indianapolis. The athletic side of sports is always talked about in sports management programs at colleges and universities, but the business side isn't always there. And so one of our board members is Max Siegel, who Malcolm knows very well. He's the CEO of USA Track and Field. He had brought the idea of us wrapping around not just field sports and some of the other more traditional sports, court sports and field sports, but even motorsports. With Indianapolis being the home of the Indianapolis 500 and IndyCar and other motorsports. So we're going to wrap around that. And then last but not least is going to be travel and tourism and hospitality. And so we host a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of conferences, big events. And so we want to make sure that we're helping to build the workforce in those 3 primary areas. And then while still staying focused on our teacher preparation programs and education.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that a lot of universities, a lot of businesses need to start looking at how we can do better, how we can expand in partnership and not just look inward so much. I don't really know the Swiss system that well. I studied at Oxford University in England and was able to really digest how the differences in terms of education are there. There are some really clear things there that work better than us, and some things that don't work necessarily.
Exactly.
And
to be clear,
things that they have and we can bring in to our system of education.
Yeah, and to be clear, there's no way that we can take the Swiss model and just supplant it in United States or in Indiana. There's no way that we're going to be able to cut high school off at 10th grade in our country. But how do we take some of the benefits from that and incorporate it in what we already have?
Right. Canada is also another country that I spent a lot of time working in seeing how the really interesting thing about Canada in terms of colleges and universities, the majority of the students in colleges and universities in Canada are foreign students. They aren't Canadians themselves. they tend to go to trade schools there if you are a Canadian citizen.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, there's a lot of good that can come out of that, but how does it apply to us is the question.
Exactly.
All right. More broadly, where do you see higher education heading in the next decade? What changes do institutions need to make to remain relevant and effective? And I also am super curious about your take on educators, because I feel like, as an educator, so many of these discussions that involve educators' entire existences were not really seen as part of the solution. We're sort of taken for granted.
Sure.
And so when I think about like the biggest priorities for any university, I think innovation in attaining and retaining top talent. So you had mentioned even sort of straying away from the traditional tenured professors. There's obviously a number of financial reasons to eliminate those positions, but also I think it opens up fluidity for people that don't have 25 years experience that have been teaching the same pedagogy for 20 years. We get some new blood. So I am always speaking up for professors themselves. How do you get good talent? How do you get them excited? How do you retain them? How do they have something to offer the students? How do they feel part of a psychologically safe community?
Yeah. So so thank you. That's a lot to unpack. I'm going to take the last part of your question first, because I think your question about educators and faculty and teachers is very important and relevant, and especially for the future and their importance. So I do want to clarify that we don't have a tenure process, right? So the reason, and one of the reasons for that is that what I've learned from working at 3 other institutions is that it's not only limiting for the institution, it's also limiting for faculty members. I can't tell you how many times we've had situations where people who were on a tenure track felt unsafe to be able to speak up about certain things because they were worried that it was going to impact their ability to access tenure. There should never be a situation where a faculty member who enjoys the privilege of academic freedom should not feel that they have that freedom because of meritocracy, because of this. And so we don't have that process. What we do value and have, and it's also required by our accreditor, is that we have full-time faculty for each one of our academic programs. Where I think the opportunity exists, and I think you have some experience here, is to make sure that our full-time faculty are partnering and listening to adjunct faculty who often have have a lot more real world experience that to help guide and inform content, curriculum, and instruction. So I want to make that point. I think that's really clear. I think that where higher education is going as it relates to that is bringing more people in who can take that real world experience and translate that into classroom teaching. Martin University has organized itself around andragogy as opposed to pedagogy in terms of the approaches that our faculty take. Is simply what that means. Institutions that are focused on adult learners typically take an andragogical approach. Pedagogy is K through 12 learning, where you essentially have a teacher that stands in front of the class with a lesson plan. They teach it. The students then have to kind of almost regurgitate that information to prove that they've actually learned it, mastered it before they move forward. Andragogy is student-centered learning, where the faculty member or teacher is really the facilitator of the learning, and students learn from each other. If you ever come to Martin University and look at our classrooms, they're set up in squares and circles, and oftentimes you won't even know where the head of the class is because you never know where that faculty member will be. They help to facilitate discussions and learning amongst students. That was one of the challenges with COVID, because social learning was not necessarily able to happen the way that you would in those spaces. And so for me, the idea of allowing more access to teaching in higher ed from people who have real world experience and removing some of the barriers. You got to have a doctorate, you got to have this, that, and the other to be able to be qualified to teach on a college level. I think that'll change, and I think it is changing. And so we've kind of already leaned into that. So hopefully that answers that part of the question.
Absolutely.
Now, because I did such a good job with that part, can you remind me what the first part was?
Totally understandable. So, speaking in more broad terms, where do you see higher ed heading in the next decade? What
Yeah.
changes do institutions need to make to remain relevant and effective?
Yeah. Thank you for the reminder. So it is no question that we are at a moment of reckoning for higher education. If you just look at what the current administration and White House is considering with disbanding the Department of Education, like when in our lives will we have ever thought that that would even be something that would be discussed or considered, dismantling the U.S. Department of Education? The reason, the driver for that is that there is a lot of discontent across the country with the types of results that come out of K-12 and out of higher education. There's more students, students are taking on more debt. They're not seeing that return on that investment. We still have workforce shortage issues, regardless of how many students we educate. We have more people who are not choosing to go to college because they're concerned about the return on their investment. And is it even worth it? We have employers who are saying, you know what, we're going to remove the college degree requirement from our job posting. And we have other providers of education that are taking the place of the college degree, people who are offering professional certifications and others. So you build all that in, higher education in the United States has no choice but to change and to innovate. So where I see it going is I see it being now, I think we're going to become more collaborative than we have before. And we're going to see it more as a system that is focused on talent and workforce development and less on learning for the sake of learning and and I still think that there's going to be a focus on knowledge creation, but I think that's going to be relegated more so to research-based institutions and not necessarily some of the rest of us who are out here. I also think there's going to be some questioning about the credit hour versus competency-based education. The credit hour assumes that everybody learns at the same rate and that you spend a certain amount of hours. And after you've spent that amount of time learning something, you should have it mastered by then. Well, all you got to do is look at GPAs across the country and you know that's not the case.
Right.
So I think the idea of students learning and mastering at their own pace and being able to move on at different times is going to be another big piece of it. Last but not least, what I talked about before is credit for prior learning. I think that when people are learning things, if you take someone who served in the military and they served honorably and had all kinds of training, I don't know why we would make them go through an organizational leadership course at a university if they've had 4 years in the military of leadership training. So those are certain things that I think are going to be pervasive as we move forward in higher education. I also think that there are going to be new degrees and new ways to look at credentials. There's already conversation in the Department of Education now about what's called workforce Pell, which is essentially Pell grants, federal grant funding for something less than a college degree. So, and the accreditors are looking at that as well. So I think stackable and standalone professional credentials are going to become integrated with conversations around the degree itself. And I think it'll be looked at as a progression, or there'll be some way that they'll complement each other, like we have not talked about.
Yeah, that's great. Question for you, Dr. Huddleston. I received my PhD from the University of Arizona Global Campus. And part of the program was to travel periodically throughout my degree to be on campus, to connect with professors and other students. But it was great to be remote. The University of Maryland has a global campus. In your state of Indiana, Purdue University has a global campus.
Yeah.
And it's great for working professionals to be able to, when you can't get to places so quickly. Part of my degree, I was a single dad. I had my son sleeping on the couch behind me after his bedtime while I was working on my degree.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts in terms of those students who can't really get to the classroom or want to know more about Martin University and being a student at Martin University, but they live in the great state of Connecticut?
Yeah. So I think, that probably I probably should have talked about that in that last great question from Amanda about where higher ed is going next. I think removing the walls is something that is critically important. We are launching our first fully online Bachelor's of Business Administration program this fall, and we have applied. There's application that you have to complete, or a program that or you have to complete to be able to offer your degrees outside of your state. It's called SARA, and I forget what the acronym stands for. So we have received the approval to be able to offer our degrees across the country in a fully online format. I think if COVID taught us nothing else, it taught us that people can learn in virtual environments. There is a need to have a bit of a hybrid format. I think, with your program, and I think my program as well, there are times where you had to be residential to come together, but not for 8 weeks at a time. You can do it in a weekend or what have you. And so I think that's part of what we have incorporated in our Masters of Organizational Leadership. It will be a part of all of our programs. I think that it is an imperative that we consider it, because every institution, or most institutions, I'd say, are struggling for enrollment. And so if Martin University only leans to trying to enroll students who live in a community that surrounds Martin, or even the state of Indiana, we will not be able to compete. And so therefore, we have to think globally. And so while Purdue calls theirs a global campus and others call theirs global campuses, really, there are a lot of institutions that have global campuses, but they just don't call them that. I think that it's time for us to lean into that a little
Yeah,
bit.
that's great. Well, listen, Dr. Huddleston, this has been a great conversation.
I agree.
Before we go, what's one message you'd like to share with students, faculty, and community members about Martin University's mission and future?
Yeah. So simply put, Martin University exists to shape people's lives, to create individual and generational wealth, and to advance our society, our communities, and our economy. And so we believe the best way to do that is to ensure that we start with the end in mind. When we talk about student success, we want to make sure that our students are defining their success. We are not defining it for them. And all we do is walk alongside them to make sure that they achieve that success, whether it be career success, academic success, economic success, or all of the above. Our goal is to be their partner in their own success. And that's what we've always been about.
Great. That's wonderful. So for those who want to support or learn about Martin University, where should they go?
Go to www.martin.edu, and you'll learn everything you can. By the way, up in the right-hand corner of that website is a button that has the word donate on it. And if you want to be an investment partner of Martin University, there is a great opportunity for you there.
I think that's a good plug in to donate money. We've talked about the investment for Martin University and the funding. So I think it's important that we do support universities like Martin. So thank you for that plug. That's it for today's episode of Bridging Worlds. If you enjoyed this conversation, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky, and visit us at www.bridgingworldspodcast.com for more.
Till next time, keep bridging worlds and keep growing.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, man.
Okay.
Outstanding, brother.
All right. Yeah.